April 24th, 1969. Quan Loy, South Vietnam. By dawn, the man everyone called Mad Dog was lining up for a raid that even veterans of MACV-SOG considered a bad bet. Jerry Michael Shriver had already survived years of cross-border reconnaissance, had already built a reputation so extreme that Radio Hanoi reportedly put a bounty on his head, and had already reached the point where men around him could see something changing. The public legend said he was fearless. The private truth was darker. Some of the men who knew him best later said he had started to feel that his luck was running out. That is what makes his last mission more than a war story. It is a question. When the most aggressive operator in one of America's most secret units finally disappeared, was it because the enemy beat him, because command accepted impossible odds, or because a man who wanted out could not bring himself to leave his people behind? The target lay in Cambodia, in the Fishhook region near the North Vietnamese command network associated with COSVN. Bay 52 strikes were scheduled. A SOG raider force would go in afterward. But the mission was compromised before it truly began. Only 5 Hueys were flyable that morning, which meant not all of the assault force could go in at once. One helicopter in the first lift then had to abort with mechanical problems, further weakening the raid. Worse still, according to later accounts from SOG veterans, the rules governing Cambodia sharply limited tactical air support despite the scale of the danger on the ground. This was the kind of contradiction that defined the secret war. The mission was important enough to risk elite men, but politics still narrowed the tools available to keep them alive. If stories where secret missions, bad odds, and one man under pressure collide are your thing, subscribe now. Because this raid into Cambodia only gets harder to explain the closer you get to the truth. When the helicopters touched down, the jungle did not behave like a bomb-shocked ruin. It answered with organized fire. Survivors later described machine gun bunkers and entrenched positions opening up almost immediately as the raiders tried to move off the landing zone. DPAA's official summary is more restrained, but no less devastating. The platoon-sized force came under heavy fire from a numerically superior enemy. A prolonged firefight followed, and repeated strikes still could not secure the ground. In the middle of that chaos, Shriver was seen moving toward the tree line. Within minutes, radio contact with him was gone. He would never be seen again. That is the spine of the story, not the myth of an indestructible commando, not the easy version where a legend simply vanishes into the jungle. The real pressure point is the last advance into the trees, because to understand why Jerry Shriver moved forward when others were pinned, you have to go backward, into the reputation that trapped him, the war that kept extending him, and the bond that made walking away harder than staying. Jerry Michael Shriver was born on September 24, 1941, in Defuniak Springs, Florida, and later entered the Army from California. He went through airborne training, served briefly with the 101st Airborne, and by the middle of the decade was inside the world that fit him best: Special Forces and then the covert machinery around MACV-SOG. He also served in West Germany and Taiwan before his deeper Vietnam years turned him from a skilled soldier into something more obsessive and harder to define. By 1966 and 1967, he was operating with units that specialized in long-range reconnaissance and violent, deniable missions in border regions and beyond them. Here the mythology begins, but it did not appear from nowhere. The operational pattern was real. Tiny teams, hostile ground, bad extraction windows, and an enemy who often outnumbered them many times over. SOG veterans and later histories describe Shriver as the kind of man who did not just tolerate that environment, but seemed most alive in it. He was known for carrying pistols and short weapons, for rejecting long rifles, and for moving toward gunfire instead of away from it. That image sounds exaggerated until you notice how often different sources, official and unofficial, converge around the same idea. He was the operator other operators talked about. His relationship with the Montagnards mattered just as much as his weapons or reputation. Hatchet force and reconnaissance elements depended heavily on indigenous fighters from Vietnam's highlands, and Shriver earned a deep loyalty among the men he led. Accounts describe him living closely with them, fighting beside them, and spending money on their families. This matters because it reframes his later choices. He was not staying in the field only for adrenaline or ego. He was also staying because the men beside him were no abstraction. They were his team in the hardest sense of the word. One incident from October 23, 1967, became inseparable from his legend. Deep in Cambodia, his small team was pressed against a lake and threatened by enemy forces closing from multiple directions. According to later accounts, while the situation was being described over the radio, Shriver gave the line that outlived him. He had the enemy surrounded from the inside. It is the kind of quote that sounds too polished to trust at first glance, but it appears consistently across later retellings from the SOG world because it fit both the tactical situation and the man's reputation. More important than the line itself is what it reveals. Jerry Shriver's fame was not built merely on surviving firefights. It was built on turning encirclement into identity. That kind of reputation can become its own trap. And this is where the story stops being simple admiration. Because once a man becomes Mad Dog, people stop seeing what it costs to remain him. Behind the legend was exhaustion. Major John Plaster's account, based on interviews with men from that world, preserves one of the most revealing contradictions in Shriver's story. Some fellow Green Berets recalled that he had begun to fear death, that he did not think he would live much longer, and that he wanted to stop running recon, but never fully did. Another officer, Charlie Norton, was so alarmed by the casualty pattern among experienced recon men that he argued against approving repeated extensions. In Norton's view, signing off on more tours for operators like Shriver was close to signing their death warrants. That warning did not stop the system. SOG still needed its most experienced men, and those men were still the ones most likely to volunteer again. That is one of the ugliest tensions in the whole story. Shriver's courage made him valuable. His value made him reusable, and the more reusable he became, the less likely anyone was to save him from himself. There is no need to invent villainy here. The pressure was built into the war. Command needed proven men for high-priority missions. The men themselves were often too proud, too committed, or too psychologically fused with the fight to step off the wheel. In that sense, the rivalry in this story is not between two decorated officers glaring across a conference table. It is between a man and the reputation that had become stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. The April 24th raid concentrated all of that pressure into one morning. The target was important. The force was incomplete. Fire support was constrained. Then the enemy responded from prepared positions. In Plaster's reconstruction, Shriver radioed that a bunker on his left front had his men pinned. Others were pinned as well. A medic trying to recover a wounded man was killed. No one else could effectively suppress the gun that had trapped Shriver's element. So, Shriver did what his legend almost required him to do. He got up and led a charge with Montagnard fighters into the tree line. If that account is correct in every detail, it was an act of desperate aggression. If some details remain uncertain, the broad outline still stands. He advanced into the worst fire on the field to break the position holding his men down. And that is the collision point of the whole documentary, not when he vanished. The real break comes a few seconds earlier, when the mythology and the man become impossible to separate. Did Shriver charge because it was tactically necessary? Almost certainly. Did he charge because he was the kind of soldier who always moved toward the decisive point? Yes, but there is also a harsher possibility. By then, backing away may have been psychologically harder for him than going forward. Mad Dog was a battlefield identity with no easy off switch. On April 24th, 1969, that identity finally met a situation it could not overpower. There is a tempting version of this story that turns Jerry Shriver into a superhuman ghost and leaves it there. It is a great legend. It is also incomplete. The missing piece is not just enemy strength, it is structure. The raid into Cambodia sat inside the bizarre logic of a secret war that wanted results without visibility. Later, SOG accounts emphasize how absurd that could become. B-52s could pulverize an area, yet tactical air support was still constrained by political sensitivities tied to Cambodia's supposed neutrality. Helicopter availability was already thin on the morning of the assault. One abort made it worse. That does not erase Shriver's agency, but it changes the frame. The last mission of MACV-SOG's most feared operator was not simply a duel between one warrior and the NVA. It was also a product of planning friction, aircraft shortages, rules of engagement, and the chronic willingness to ask tiny covert units to solve problems that conventional force packages would have struggled to survive. That is why the accepted story can feel misleading when told too cleanly. The heroism is real, so is the system that consumed it. Jerry Shriver did not disappear because courage failed. He disappeared in a mission profile designed around speed, secrecy, and understrength violence. Even the official record reflects the brutal end state. The team had to be extracted under continuous fire, and that fire prevented recovery of dead and missing personnel. There is no cinematic closure here, no confirmed body, no final witness standing over him, only fragments, radio memories, and the silence that follows a battlefield too hot to search properly. And there is one more reframing that matters. Accounts differ on small details, and some colorful stories around Shriver have grown in the retelling. That happens to figures like him. But the core truth survives the noise. He was not merely a violent eccentric dropped into history from nowhere. He was one of the most experienced covert ground operators in a war built on attrition, deniability, and repetition. When he sensed that his time was running out, he was probably reading the logic of the system as much as his own nerves. In that light, his last mission looks less like a random tragedy and more like the final bill for years of extensions and improbable survivals. After April 24th, 1969, the facts become spare and cold. Shriver was not recovered. Later, U.S. records treated him as missing, then presumptively dead. DPAA still lists him as unaccounted for and in active pursuit. His name is memorialized on the Courts of the Missing in Honolulu and on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The war kept moving. The legend did too. That unfinished ending is exactly why Jerry Shriver has remained such a powerful figure in Special Forces memory. His story offers everything warrior culture tends to preserve: aggression, loyalty, composure under fire, contempt for odds, the famous line on the radio, the last sight of him driving toward danger instead of away from it. But if you stop there, you miss the part that actually gives the story weight. The real payoff is not that Mad Dog was fearless. It is that even a man like that may have seen the end coming and kept going anyway. Not because death was glamorous, because the war had given him a role, a tribe, and a reputation that were easier to die inside than to leave behind. So, who was Jerry Shriver really? He was a decorated Green Beret, an MACV-SOG operator, born in Florida and sent into the war from California. He was a leader of Montagnard fighters in some of the most dangerous ground missions of the Vietnam War. He was a man credited with exceptional valor in repeated cross-border operations. He was also a case study in what happens when a military system keeps returning to the same rare men, because they are the ones most likely to succeed. Somewhere between those truths, the nickname swallowed the person. Mad Dog became a legend long before he became a disappearance. And that may be the hardest conclusion of all. The enemy did not simply trap the most terrifying man in Vietnam. The war did. The secrecy did. The demand for one more mission did. By the time Jerry Shriver walked toward that tree line in Cambodia, the question was no longer whether he could break contact one more time. The question was whether anyone around him had ever really expected him to stop. He vanished before the story could answer that, which is exactly why people still tell it.